Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining today's presentation. Before we start, I would like to personally thank the organizers of the event for giving us the opportunity to speak to you today. By way of introduction, my name is Thomas Borrel, and I'm Chief Product Officer at Polymath. Over the next 25-30 minutes, we're going to talk about security tokens and the regulatory landscape, what's possible now and what's coming next. But before we get into the details of the presentation, I'd like to talk a little bit about Polymath. Polymath is a software company driven by a vision of a world where everyone has equal access to economic growth. What we're doing to execute on this vision is automating and simplifying regulated markets through blockchain. And to get there, we're contributing to a dependable, compliance-focused blockchain that can help connect market participants and grow the security tokens market. Now, when we're talking about security tokens, I feel we cannot really talk about tokenization without talking about ERC20. The ERC20 standard was created by Fabian Vogelstell and Vitalik Buterin back in November of 2015, and it's at the origin of most of the tokens released to this day. But at its very core, the ERC20 standard, the functionalities that it provides are not aligned with the needs of securities. And that's understandable. ERC20 was simply not designed for that. Specifically, organizations that were using an ERC20 token could mandate KYC for primary issuance, but once the token was in its owner's wallets, they could no longer enforce KYC for any secondary trades. What this means is that with a standard like ERC20, you would not really have certainty of ownership or an up-to-date cap table, nor could you have a recovery mechanism in the event of a loss of private key. Now, this idea of a loss of private key has significant repercussions. For example, let's assume that Alice owned 10% of Acme Incorporated. If Alice lost a private key, the value of Acme would not go down by 10%, or everyone's positions would not increase by 10%. Much like Alice had the option in traditional markets to get her share certificates reissued, she also needed a way to recover her assets in the event of a loss of private key when those assets are security tokens. So from the early days using ERC20, 2018 started a wave of experimentation with proprietary implementations designed to solve these shortcomings. These implementations included the DS protocol from Securitize, RToken from Harbor, T-Rex from Tokeny, and ST20 from Polymath. These implementations introduced some of the critical capabilities that were required to support security tokens. And these included the ability to enforce transfer restrictions to make sure that all token holders had to go through KYC on both primary and secondary markets. They could also enforce lockups associated with Reg D exemptions, which was leveraged by early security token pioneers. So effectively applying in a technology agnostic way established exemptions such as Regulation D to security tokens. Some of these implementations were also supplemented by additional capabilities, such as the enforcement of volume restrictions, all in support of a strong desire to reduce the cost of issuance and servicing of assets through the automation brought forth by blockchain. Another important enhancement these implementations brought to market was the ability to recover assets in the event of a loss of private key. These enhancements were certainly useful when it came to security tokens, but they did come at a price. This multitude of proprietary implementation was creating friction for the rest of the industry. Before they could custody or trade a security token, custodians, ATSs, exchanges needed to perform an extensive due diligence on the code associated with the tokens, in addition to the standard business due diligence they needed to perform. And that obviously was a problem. And when your goal is to simplify and automate capital markets, you can't really introduce new problems or add material complexity where there shouldn't be any. So as Polymath, we took it upon ourselves to solve that problem. And to do that, we brought together 25 companies ranging from law firms to exchanges, custodians, auditors, KYC providers, former regulators, transfer agents, essentially bridging the traditional capital markets with blockchain with the goal to produce a standard. From that multi-day workshop came ERC 1400. The standard was proposed in September of 2018, and after rigorous review by the community, started seeing some adoption in early 2019. ERC 1400 is an umbrella of standard. It includes 6-7 ERCs designed to standardize very specific aspects of the management of securities, which include the ability to conserve UBO rights for custodied assets. ERC 1400 is also backwards compatible with ERC 20, which means that no custom custody solution is required to custody ERC 1400 tokens. Lastly, as regulation was still and frankly continues to evolve, ERC 1400 was designed to be modular, so new functionality could be added as required based on the evolution of the regulatory landscape. Some of the early adopters of the ERC 1400 standard, in addition to Polymath, were established industry participants like Consensus. Recently, Consensus shared that back in 2018, they had chosen the ERC 1400 standard because it was a more evolved standard that allowed tokenized assets to perform highly controllable token transfers. Obviously, seeing market participants embrace ERC 1400 and supporting the efforts, the standardization effort is great. But with more recent regulatory clarification, what we've seen as well are institutions sharing their use of the ERC 1400 standard. One of the most notable ones is BNP Paribas Security Services, who announced back in October of this year, of 2020, that they had completed a proof of concept with Curve for the secure transfer of digital assets, and that to accomplish that, they had carried out the transaction using the ERC 1400 token standard. Obviously, seeing an institution the size of BNP Paribas being very public with their use of the standard is obviously very encouraging, and a testament to the drive for institutions to embrace security tokens, as well as the ability for the standard to deliver key regulatory capabilities. But looking back at late 2018 and throughout 2019 and 2020, we've seen a continuous stream of clarifications and regulatory updates coming from market regulators across the world. Some of the most notable examples include the SEC and FINRA, the joint statement back in August of 2019, which outlined that when a third party is used to custody securities for a broker-dealer, that party must satisfy the rule as a good control location. And this statement could potentially raise some questions when it comes to the use of smart contracts to perform the atomic swap of securities versus some form of digital cash, essentially doing some type of digital form of DVP executed on blockchain. One of the more recent examples include the German draft law on the introduction of electronic securities. In this draft, the German Federal Ministry of Justice and Consumer Protection, along with the Federal Ministry of Finance, indicated that blockchain and DLT systems can only be used for maintaining a crypto securities register if they sufficiently ensure the finality of transactions. In other words, for the blockchain to contain a true representation of ownership, transaction finality must be ensured. And that's a well-known issue on most public blockchains. The same German draft law also clarifies that in order to transfer ownership of an electronic security, the electronic security must be transferred to the buyer on the instructions of the beneficiary, and both parties must agree that the right is to be transferred. In other words, not only do we need trade confirmation, but we also need trade affirmation from both counterparties. And similar statements were made in the Liechtenstein Blockchain Act, the Token and Trusted Technology, or TT, Service Providers Law. This too is a well-known limitation with public blockchain. Another manifestation of that has been airdrops. All of us who have wallets on one or more blockchain have received airdrops, tokens we didn't necessarily knew existed or had any interest in holding. Tokens are assets that could potentially taint our wallet if they originated from a source that was flagged by blockchain analysis companies like CipherTrace, Chainalysis, or OnChain as high risk. Another manifestation here is travel rule. If we look into the requirements as they were formulated by Swiss's FINMA, financial intermediaries must verify the identity of third parties when they transfer from external wallets, which actually speaks to the need for an identity system for the payment leg of a security token system in addition to the securities leg, as well as making additional verifications such as beneficial ownership, which speaks to potentially keeping transfers in a pending state so diligence can be completed prior to the affirmation. Now, obviously, due diligence ideally is completed ahead of the transfer being initiated, but in the event of a third-party initiated transfer, that may not always happen, which highlights the need for a more complete settlement system. So as an industry, we've been very consistent in asking for regulatory clarity. Now that clarity is improving, the next question we need to ask ourselves is, what are we going to do about it? The first thing perhaps should be to look at the underlying blockchain. And today, most security tokens are built on Ethereum. Now, back in 2018, 2019, and Polymath was no exception to that. That's where all the security tokens were built. That's where the proprietary implementations we discussed a moment ago were being released. The blockchain was live. It had all the tools to build a tokenization platform. And that's also where the ecosystem was building, specifically custodians, exchanges, KYC, ML providers, all these on-chain services. But when we revisit that decision and apply the statements we've looked at a moment ago, the picture doesn't seem as clear anymore. Specifically, we know that Ethereum does not offer natively transfer control or asset recovery. It's a non-ESG friendly blockchain that offers probabilistic finality, which we just discussed is a barrier to making the Ethereum blockchain the golden record for asset ownership. It also does not provide any affirmation mechanism, which we've seen with all the airdrops that we've experienced. It is also designed and architected to support a variety of use cases, which in one sense is great, but also means that capital markets related operations need to be conducted via smart contracts. And that includes the atomic settlement of a transaction. Now back to that first statement we reviewed, how can one make a smart contract a good control location? But that's not all. As we dig deeper, we see that Ethereum is susceptible to hard forks. And when you have a security token that is backed by an asset on a chain that hard forks, you now end up with two tokens. Well, which one is the one that's backed by the building in the case of a real estate token? The fork did not cause a second building to magically appear. KPMG published a very interesting paper on this topic back in November of 18 that spoke to the institutionalization of crypto assets and specifically highlighted the challenges of hard forks and how they required organizations to form committees to decide on the handling of the fork as they could cause legal and tax issues. Now, with our goal to automate and simplify capital markets, we need to be very careful not to shift the problem from one domain to another. The problem of hard forks is one that didn't exist before. It is very specific to blockchain. Additionally, you have a chain that is built on core principles that is orthogonal that are orthogonal to capital markets. Specifically, pseudonymity. Capital markets require identity, transparency. Capital markets require intellectual property of its participants, which for investment bank, for example, has to do for their trade with their trades and their positions. That intellectual property must be protected. And censorship resistance when we know capital markets are highly regulated. Sure, innovation like ERC 1400 has resolved some of those challenges by automating the transfer controls, including the need for KYC or enabling asset recovery. ERC 1400 is also empowering users with additional functionality, such as the ability to simplify and automate corporate actions, like capital distribution or voting. And so if we look at the gaps highlighted by some of the regulatory clarity, we see the need for deterministic finality, trade affirmation, but also fork resistance. We see the need for built-in identity, privacy, confidentiality, as well as the need for a transition from proof of work to proof of stake to support environmental, social, and corporate governance initiatives that are taking place across the financial sector. And so based on this, the question remains, what can we do to create an environment that can apply these new regulations? How can we address these gaps, but also new ones that may come up along the way? The situation we're facing right now is not that different from one that we faced back 20, 30 years ago. And that's with a very well-known industry, which started by building on an existing infrastructure. And that's the internet. Back in the 90s, when the internet was gaining adoption, home internet was running on existing phone lines. Connection speeds were capped back in 1991 at 14.4K. That was painfully slow. And as a result, what you could do was very limited. Content delivery had to follow very strict rules if you wanted your user experience to be tolerable. So using that existing infrastructure, it took 3 years to double that speed to 28.8 and another 7 years to quadruple it. And even then, it was still very slow. But there we were, 7 years and millions of dollars of R&D later, still painfully slow and still facing the same demand from its users, speed. For innovators in the space, whatever connection people had were never enough to deliver the expected services and experience. In other words, the industry was constrained by that legacy infrastructure. New services could not be delivered or even imagined because of that legacy infrastructure. But what does that have to do with security tokens? When the problem back then was mostly speed, it was a different symptom that originated from the same root cause. Back then, we were using an infrastructure that was pervasive, but that was not fit for purpose. And we were spending millions of dollars in R&D to turn it into something it was not designed to do. We were seeing slow incremental benefits, but nothing really transformative. Security token on a general purpose blockchain are very much like that. And we've heard some of the comments in presentations today and in prior events that are very much aligned to that. You need to build identity on top of a chain that was built for pseudonymity. You need to build compliance on top of a chain that was built for censorship resistance. So asset transfers can follow certain rules. You need to build confidentiality and privacy on top of a chain built for transparency. And you need to address probabilistic settlement finality. What the internet has shown us is that to meet users' demand and enable those new services, we need to transition from general purpose to purpose built. And so instead of going through that painful phase of small incremental improvements, we're now transitioning to a purpose-built blockchain and seeing this move enable significant innovation to address the hurdles we've just talked about. That purpose-built infrastructure is Polymesh. And so if we look at where Polymesh is now, the Polymesh testnet is live, and its current version addresses today 3 of the 4 core pillars. Governance, as the chain is designed to be fork resistance. Identity, with all network participants, from users to node operators and service providers, needed to have their own digital identity to use the chain. And compliance, with financial primitives built directly into a chain that embeds a settlement engine designed to allow transactions, which can use a real-time gross settlement or netting system, support atomic swaps without the need for a smart contract to hold custody of both assets for the swap to occur, and that requires both counterparties to affirm the transaction before it is executed. So airdrops and other unwanted delivery of tokens can be prevented by the recipients themselves. The confidentiality piece is built as well, and we've also published a white paper that describes MERCAT. MERCAT stands for Mediated Encrypted Secure Asset Transfers, but we decided that it was prudent for the chain to start without confidentiality, so troubleshooting could be performed easily, and then add it at a later stage once the chain had a chance to stretch its legs a little bit. So what does it look like from a scheduling perspective? Well, the first Polymesh testnet went live in May of this year, with a general adoption in June. Since then, several areas and chain tools have been exercised through series of testing events and product launches, ranging from Token Studio, which is an interface for organizations to create, structure, and manage their token, to governance, an interface for token holders to submit and signal their support on an improvement proposal that to improve, make changes to the chain, to as well the settlement engine, which went into test late last month. These are there's a few more upgrades that are planned this month and next month, with a target date for mainnet of Q1 2021. The market response for Polymesh so far has been very encouraging, with institutions interested in either joining the chain as a node operator or delivering their own services on that chain. The community has also been very supportive and very active with the various tests that took place over the past 6 months. And the data we're seeing so far does confirm that security tokens were in need of a transition from general purpose to a purpose-built blockchain. Last, just to close off with some information, and then we'll leave it open for Q&A. So if you're looking to find out more about Polymesh, you can read our white paper on the Polymath website. You can also look for instructions on how to join the testnet and participate into the testnet on the Polymath website as well. And I've also included my email address at the bottom here, should you have any additional questions or any interest in discussing this further. With that, I'd like to thank everyone for your attention. We still have a few minutes left for Q&A, so I'll let you ask any questions you might have and answer them directly via the chat. Thank you very much. Have a great conference. Have a great rest of your day, and hoping to talk to all of you very soon.